Representatives from more than 190 nations are meeting in Lima, Peru for a UN climate conference to discuss new limits for greenhouse gases. The work in Lima will focus on preparing a draft agreement for a conference next year in Paris. The talks have gained momentum in the past 2 months, with pledges from the world's top carbon polluters, including China, the United States and the European Union, to limit their emissions over the next 10 to 15 years. On the eve of the summit, activists from the group Greenpeace projected a message onto the historic Machu Picchu site, calling for the use of renewable energy.
Is calling on the world leaders to transfer the energy system away from coal and oil towards a 100% renewable energy future by mid-century.
Indigenous groups are also in Lima to call attention to environmental issues affecting their communities. Joining me now for the latest on the climate talks is Nick Nuttall. He's the head of communications and outreach for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Nick, what can we expect from this meeting? What are the negotiators trying to achieve?
Well, you know, this is the latest iteration of a process that's going to lead to a new universal agreement on climate change in Paris in 2015. And here in Lima, there are some of the final nuts and bolts that need to be put into place so that that treaty, that new agreement in Paris can actually happen. So we're looking at a whole range of issues, but mainly governments have actually agreed that they will, in the first quarter of 2015, outline what they are going to contribute to this new agreement in terms of emission reductions, in terms of finance, in terms of technology, and in terms of building the capacity of developing countries. And we need to decide, in the sense that this meeting, governments need to decide exactly how those contributions will look. For many developing countries, for example, they may not do economy-wide emission reductions. They may do sectors like forests, or they may do things like energy intensity targets. So they're going to look here in Lima precisely how they will contribute during the first quarter of 2015 in terms of what they can do for the Paris Agreement. So that's one of the main outcomes here in Lima.
There already appears to be some disagreement over what the meeting will achieve. The headline in The Guardian: EU and US at odds over carbon emissions. The European Union wants binding limits, and the US wants to leave it to individual countries to decide how much they want to limit emissions by. How big is this division?
I don't think it's particularly big. The fact is that there is a debate about how much the new treaty in Paris will be legally binding and how much will be the responsibility of individual governments. And that debate is going on here in Lima, and that debate will continue into 2015. But I think the atmosphere here is actually one that's perhaps never been so positive. What the EU has done is put an emission reduction target on the table. As you know, China and the United States have put something on the table too, and there has been money flowing since the pledging conference in Berlin a few weeks ago towards assisting developing countries with their ambitions in terms of climate change. Now, you have to remember that normally in this process, everything happens at the last minute. It's a bit like pulling teeth. The fact that governments are putting forward money, putting forward emission reduction targets well in advance of when they had to, is quite a unique experience in this whole process in terms of climate change.
So I'm wondering how this happens at the meeting, how these negotiations take place. Does every nation hand in its own plan to cut carbon emissions?
Yes, this is what we are expecting and we anticipate and almost certain about. In the first quarter of 2015, each government will come forward with their contribution, as we call it, to the Paris Agreement, so emission reductions, money, this sort of thing. Every country is doing it, from small island developing states up to big emitters like China and the United States. So everybody, because it will be a universal agreement in Paris, everybody's agreed that they will do this, depending on the state of their economies, depending on the point in their development paths. So this will be a feature of the first quarter of 2015, but we just need to finalize the ground rules about how countries actually do it and what actually they put in these contributions, as we call them.
Right, and how is all that forged into a coordinated document that the UN can produce that will bind these countries to those limits?
Well, they are working on the draft agreement here in Lima, and then there'll be a further meeting in February in Geneva, and by something like May of next year, that draft agreement will go to all the cabinets of all the governments of the world, for all ministers, the transport minister, the finance minister, you know, the prime minister, the president, whatever, to actually look and make sure that it fits in with what they want to do in terms of their national aspirations. And from there, this will then proceed on during the summer towards Paris. So, you know, it's a process, and it's been going for several years now, as you know. But there is every reason to believe that everything is on track, everything is moving in the right direction. There will be bumps along the road. You mentioned a debate about how legally binding the agreement in Paris will be. That's part of the debate, but that's quite normal. We've got 190 plus countries, trying to come together with consensus. And sometimes there are bumps along the road, but the bumps right now do not seem to be as big. And the hills and the mountains that have been there in the past do not seem as high as they are today. And so that's why there is a sense of confidence here in Lima that things are on track for Paris.
Let's look at Europe. Your organization is based in Europe. The European Union wants to reduce carbon emissions by 40%. That's from 1990 levels, and they want to do that by 2030. What is Europe bringing to the table? How does it hope to achieve that goal?
Well, yeah, actually, what they've actually said is at least 40%. So indeed, they have opened the door to something even higher. We will see over time whether they can go beyond that 40%, but they put that very clear thing, at least 40%. Well, the European Union has been pioneering emission reductions for many, many years now, and you look at the penetration of renewable energy, for example. We're headquartered in Germany. I mean, on a given day in Germany, you might see something like 50% of the energy produced in that country coming from renewables, things like rooftop solar. So, Denmark, you look at the huge wind energy industry there, and these have all grown because of the anticipation of, tighter and tighter deals at the international level. So the European Union is looking across many things, increasing their energy efficiency, emissions from agriculture and things like this. So they feel very confident that they can achieve that target over their 1990 levels, which is very encouraging. And I think the signal from Europe and the signal from the US and China that we've had is now empowering other countries around the world to see, okay, well, what can we do as well? So we are in a very different world to perhaps Copenhagen in 2009. A solar panel now is 80% cheaper than it was then. Wind power is 40% cheaper than it was then. And the whole economic arguments are now engaging industries, corporations, and cities. So here in Lima, again, the role of cities, the role of business, in terms of helping governments deliver on their targets, is very much at the fore and will be throughout the next year into Paris. So this is why I think there's a sense of confidence. A lot of people feel it can be done now. I think a few years ago, people were worried, could we really do it, or would it destroy our economies? I think a lot of progressive countries, including many in Europe, see attacking climate change, dealing with climate change, as a way of moving to a resource-efficient, low-carbon economy, as a way of actually generating new jobs, generating new businesses. And that kind of argument's been around for some years, but many, many governments, I think, now get it, especially in Europe, but not just particularly in Europe.
Nick, I've just got a little more time left, but I must ask you about funding. You mentioned that a moment ago. The Global Climate Fund has something like $9.7 billion right now. That's still way off from the $100 billion per year that was promised at the Copenhagen summit, wasn't it?
Absolutely. This is just the beginning. We are looking forward to that 100 billion by 2020. I think the 10 billion, you have to see it, or just under 10 billion, as leveraging money. How can you actually take that 10 billion and actually bring in private sector money as well? The issue of the 10 billion for the Green Climate Fund is practical in terms of leveraging more investment. It's also political because developing countries see this as an important step forward, and it's one way towards that $100 billion that was promised in Copenhagen. But even now, I think you can see around the world, even just in renewable energy, right? I mean, there's something like $240 billion being invested every year in renewable energy right now, both in developed and developing countries. So there is a sea change in the finance. The 10 billion is a beginning for the Green Climate Fund. That's very welcome, and I'm sure we'll see more investment in that over the coming months and years.
Nick Nuttall, thank you for joining us, sir.